There's a CEU sign-in sheet, and then you have some forms at your tables. You have a separate sign-in sheet that's going to ask for your name, your contact information, your treatment specialties. Please fill that out and leave it at the table. And then also there is an evaluation form. And we ask that you please fill those out and then leave those at the tables when you leave. And please stay afterwards. If you want to continue networking, you're more than welcome to. I just want to say a bit about Omega Recovery myself. I had first met with David and Dr. Kardaras several weeks ago, and immediately I felt a connection to Omega Recovery, their vision, their mission, and I can say from being in the addiction and mental health treatment field as a professional, sometimes a client, for 14 years, I can say that what they're bringing to Austin is something truly innovative and very unique. So what I want to do, and I'm very, very blessed to be a part of it, I want to take the opportunity quickly and thank Marsha Robinson for helping. Marsha played a big part in the open house, and the open house is June 9th, and we're going to talk more about that in a bit. And then Max and Benita, who have also helped with marketing and technology. Yeah, really best for that. So, I think that's it. Without further ado, where is David? Mr. David Naylor, co-founder, co-owner.
I'm a little nervous. Hey, crowds. But I just want to take a moment and thank everyone for being here. There are several familiar faces here, and I kind of stumbled into this industry about 9 years ago. My world came crashing down. My father passed away. I went through bankruptcy, and at that point, that was the end of my road. Everyone in this field who goes through this recovery has to reach an end of their road. And in that moment, in my father's cabin up in the Ozarks up in Arkansas, which I hated for many years, and my dad moved to Arkansas, is where I actually hit my knees and God found me in a really dark place. And but that was the day I also found life. And ever since then, I'll save the details of that journey, but it's been a journey, and it's been a journey of healing, it's been a journey of recovery, of transformation, of maturity, and raising a little 10-year-old that was very wounded and very frozen and really paralyzed. And I got to thank a lot of people in my life today. And I want to give a big special shout out to the Bridge to Recovery in Kentucky. I went to that place and it saved my life. And I learned how to rescue that little kid that was so lost and scared and wounded. And to this day, he's still lost and scared and wounded. He has somebody that's looking out for him, and that's me. I'm looking out for that little kid today and learning to raise that kid up. And everything in my life today is from God. And it's a blessing. And I have no credentials, but luckily I have a partner that God brought, and his wife, his kids, and his amazing man, Dr. Kardaras. So I just want to thank him and everybody here who's been a part of my journey. Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce someone very special to me. She's like a sister. She's been here since pretty much day one. And it's this person has stuck by me, the vision, the mission, the heart, and I've watched her evolve and grow in such amazing ways. And she actually has a story to tell because she has what would we call it, an icebreaker little thing. But without any further ado, that's Gabriella Jeffers, our Director of Admissions. Gabby.
Hi, my name is Gabriella Jeffers, and I'm the Director of Admissions and Outreach for Omega, as well as Bridgeware, Sober Living Community. I am wearing a sling. I feel like I've told this story now 100 times. Just today, I was actually hit by a car last week. We're walking my dog. I'm okay. I dislocated my shoulder, but I am in a sling. That's what's going on with my shoulder right now, or why you guys see me in a sling. So I came on to Bridgeway in April of 2016. I had previously worked at Hickory Wind Ranch Sober Living, which some of you probably know since it was one of the first sober livings in Austin with Holly Parsons. I worked there for 4 years. I was a resident there for 8 months, and I started working for Hickory Wind the day after I moved out. So it's something that I feel passionate about and it saved my life. So I've been in sober living essentially since 2012, so 6 years now. Bridgeway when Bridgeway bought out Hickorywood Ranch. So when I came on, David had 3 homes and no staffing, and we had, you know, it was just kind of him and me running things, and it's grown into what it is today, which is really good. And I know it's been David's dream to have, you know, some kind of IOP and clinical supports and doing some really innovative things that, you know, maybe wasn't seeing being done in the Central Texas area. So it's really amazing that Dr. K came on and this is coming to fruition, and we're going to be able to touch as many demographics as possible, because we, you know, really are going to do a dual diagnosis program and also be able to work with co-occurring. And that's something near and dear to my heart as well, dual diagnosis and co-occurring. So, but yeah, I do the admissions, so I'm on the phone all day long and all night long. My boyfriend says that I'm really, I have a small skill set, but one of my skills is I'm awesome on the phone. I'm really good at it. I always have. That's always been my thing, even in my previous career. So anyway, just wanted to introduce myself. I'm going to be introducing Michael Smeltzer, who's our program director, who's awesome. He runs the day-to-day operations. He's in the trenches. He came on 3 months ago, and we have seen dramatic changes in our programming and structure since he's been at Bridgeway. He and I are very tight on the phone many times a day, so he's kind of the back end and I'm the front end. So, Smeltzer.
I'll tell you what, it's going to take a lot more than a Honda Fit to take out Gabby. So like Gabby said, I'm the program director for Bridgeway Sober Living Omega Recovery. I came on about 3 months ago. Like so many of us in this field, I have my own personal journey in recovery, and for a guy like me, having been through it, and now being on this side of it, the most important thing for me is to be involved with people that have a strong ethical foundation. And so this team that's being assembled at Omega definitely has that strong ethical foundation, which is so important to me. I'm a native local Austinite, so I'm glad to be doing work here in my city. Like Abby said, I'm you know, direct client care, so I'm in the trenches. I'm doing case management with everybody that's in sober living under Omega, and I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you guys for coming out. This is a beautiful turnout. If you don't know me, please come introduce yourself. I'm easy to get along with. Definitely come say hi, and I want to meet everybody. So come introduce yourself. And it's a pleasure to be able to introduce who I get to introduce, who has unparalleled energy. She's fairly new to the team, and so I'm still getting to know her. And I'd like to introduce you to our Director of Operations, Kimberly Allen.
I can't do that because I feel emotional, and I'll tell you why. I'm Kimberly Allen, and I think I know a fair number of you. But they asked us to talk about ourselves, but Anthony also said for me to not talk too long. I find that exceedingly difficult. But here's what I want you to know about me. If you don't, I think a lot of people associate me with insurance. That's true. But yes, I was fully licensed in insurance for about 10 years. I'm a licensed chemical dependency counselor. I have a master's in family studies, all that stuff. But I'll tell you who I really am. I am what's called a patient advocate. We call them clients. We don't use that word patients, but here's what it means. You know, I lost my dad to this illness, and I got thyroid cancer, and I went into recovery all at the same time. I've learned insurance, I've learned charts, I've learned how to protect and defend therapists, treatment centers, clinical records, and regulations since the 1990s, and I'm stoked about that. When I met Dr. Kardaras, I went to meet him because I noticed that he studied karate. Well, I'm a boxer, yeah. And I thought, here's who I am for all of the referrals that you make. Jab, jab, jab. You know, my job is to keep us process correct and to measure that we do exactly what we tell you we're going to do. We will take care of these individuals. We will do ethically and responsibly what we tell you that we say we're gonna do, because that's what's right to do, isn't it? In client care, that's what's right to do with you. I'm very attentive, you'll notice that when I interview you, and ask about your specialty, your credentials, because I'm the guardian. I'm the guardian of those records. I'm the guardian of this organization. And the reason I came, this is the facilitator of miracles. You know, Anthony Marengo and I, you know, they'll talk more about that. But this isn't our first rodeo. You know, we've been colleagues together, and ethically so. I'm exceedingly proud of that. For the past, I guess, 6 years. So yes, I work directly for the facilitator of miracles and the executive leadership. And the reason I took this role after being an independent researcher and consultant for all these years is when we say we're going to do quality management, we're doing quality management. We're going to measure it, and then we're going to give it back. You know what I mean? And when we make mistakes, I want you to call me. All right? That's why I wore this jacket. This is what I look like. Make a mistake, I want you to call me. You know, I'm your collaborator. You know, thank you for being here and listening about my father, because that's what got me into the insurance business and into healthcare. My heart is for you. You know, you think about the individual clients. You know what I'm thinking about? You, right? Everybody got to get paid. Yeah. All right, so it's my honor to introduce Jody Weinstein. She'll be the Director of Clinical Services. We're just going to love each other. So come on up. All right. Thank you.
So hi, I'm Jody Weinstein, and I'm thrilled to have been brought on board to Omega as the clinical director. And so today I was told to talk about who I am and what I would like to contribute to Omega in 3 minutes. So I'm going to take my full 3 minutes, but one of the reasons that I've stayed in this field and continue to work in this field and love what I do is because by the time people actually get to me, the masks that they wear on a day-to-day basis have very much been shed. And so they're in this raw, real place. And that's a place that as a therapist, I can really work with. That's a place that's really pregnant with possibility. So my hope in part of what I can bring is to really help pave and carve out a culture that's very much conducive to the nurturing of significant change. Because when people are in those places, they're ready for change, but they have to be in the right kind of space, a space that's really going to allow them to make those kind of changes. And so what does that look like? What kind of a culture are we talking about? So that would be a place where, you know, we're unconditionally accepting, a place where people can be raw and real and not be judged. It will also be a place where we uphold strong boundaries and where we teach our families to do the same thing. It would be a place where we nurture honesty, a peer-based group where we teach our members how to hold each other accountable, a place where they feel comfortable, a place where they can really feel at home. Also a place, like Kimberly mentioned, that upholds high ethical standards, because that's just as important to group safety as anything else. And finally, the final piece culture-wise is that not only will we be able to provide, you know, evidence-based practices and a really solid clinical background for clients to deal with their challenges and to deal with their struggles, but it's also going to be a place, the part that I'm the most passionate about is providing a space and an atmosphere where people can actually have the experience of their own health. You know, they can start to get glimpses of who it is that they really are. And some of the ways that we can help people tap into that are things like the water and nature and the outdoor excursions and meditation and, you know, honesty, laughter, hanging out together, doing nothing, yoga, art, mindfulness. Those are the kinds of activities where you can really start to help people realize who it is they are, because it's really not something that you can define. It's broader than a career path or a hobby. And things like nature and yoga and things of this sort are really something that helps people to tap into that. And so whenever I met with Kimberly and Dr. Kardaras and Anthony, it was really very clear to me that these guys were willing to do whatever they had to do to provide a clinical team with every avenue possible to make that experience work. And so because of that, I have no doubt that Omega is going to be an innovative place, a unique place, but even more importantly, because of the things that we're going to be able to offer, it's going to be an effective place, and a place that's going to be really impactful for families and for our clients. So anyway, that's what I'm hoping to contribute culture-wise to Omega. I'm really, really grateful to be here, and I believe I'm introducing Anthony. Anthony, is that correct? I met Anthony just about a week and a half ago, and I think 30 minutes of a conversation with you, and I was completely sold. He's an awesome guy. He fits his role, you know, like a glove, and I think that he's going to be a key component in helping create the kind of community that we want to build here at Omega. So.
My name is Anthony Marengo, and I'm the Executive Director here at Omega Recovery. And what an awesome team. I feel so honored and privileged to work with the people that we have brought together here. And the thing I want all of you to know is we are going to be working very, very hard to create an experience for our clients. And when I say that word experience, it's something that's tangible. It's something that's life-changing. And I don't want to get into my whole life story, but I got sober at 24. I was a young adult. And the place I got sober at, I was there for a year. So I believe in that continuum of care, a long-term approach. This is a long-term chronic problems that we're working with in mental health and substance use disorders. They don't get better with short-term acute care, right? I think most of us probably know that in this room. But one of the things that I got to do in my early recovery is I did things like karate, and I did yoga, and we had work ethic. You know, I was outside doing things. There was equine. You know, there were those things were every bit as impactful as the foundation I was getting to the 12 steps, as the therapy that I was doing. And you know, I've always felt very fortunate that I got to have an experience there. And then I proceeded to go and work at that place. I had a year sober. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and somebody said, "Hey, we think you'd be good here." So I got a job as a tech and took every job that I could get in that facility, and for 7 years, and been out in Texas now for 5.5 years. Working in admissions marketing capacity, and I had the pleasure of meeting with David first, and then talking with Dr. Kardaras over the phone. And when I talked to Dr. Kardaras, we were talking about karate and yoga and all these things that kind of have shaped our recoveries along the way. And I was like, this is what I experienced and more. I think it's going to be a lot more. And so I'm so excited. And as we've brought team members on board with this project, there's one thing we're not lacking of, and that's enthusiasm. There's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a lot of energy, and we want to keep that going. And one of the parts of the culture that I really hope to instill with Omega is just a positive, healthy workplace where we are all going to be learning from each other, collaborating with one another, and practicing self-care, and practicing what we preach. We want to model this healthy lifestyle to our clients. And so that's what we're about at Omega. I also, hopefully you can all remember a few things when you hear Omega Recovery. Is there have been some existing components. We have the Bridgeway Sober Living System that is under Omega Recovery. We have a 10-bed residential facility out in Maui. And so when you hear Omega Recovery as it stands right now today, is there's Omega Recovery Bridgeway. That's our sober living. We've got 100 sober living beds. There's Omega Recovery Maui. That's our 10-bed residential facility out in Maui. And starting on June 1st, we'll have our Omega Counseling and Wellness in Austin, and that's our outpatient clinic off South Lamar. So that is, and we're taking the same philosophy that you've heard all of our team members talk about here today, and we're going to be doing that at all of our locations, providing that experience for clients, getting them involved in whatever we can find that's going to provide that life-changing experience for people. And so it's very exciting. And the other thing I want to convey to all of you, very seasoned professionals and experts in what you do, is we know we need help. We're not gonna. That's the other trait that I've found common in our team, is that we all still want to keep learning. and we're going to learn from each other, but we want to learn from all of you. And something that has always been a policy of mine when we work with referral sources, our marketing strategy is to get to know as many of you as possible. We're not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the internet and the impersonal kind of marketing campaigns. We want to know our community. We want to be a resource for you. When we have information that we think is valuable, we want to do one of these CEU events and share it with you. We want to come to your CEU events. We want to learn what you have to share with us. So please, as you see us growing and maybe you see us struggling, you see things we're doing well, we welcome your feedback. We put all of our cards out there, but hopefully you can come to our open house on June 9th, come meet our staff again and spend some time with us, but we welcome your expertise and experience, and we want to learn what you know, what you've seen that works. And that's the kind of collaborative environment we want to have here at Omega. So I also, the other thing I want you to know is we're going to have an adolescent program. I think that's important. Down in South Austin at the IOP, we'll be working with adolescents. We'll do primary mental health and substance use disorders. So I know I said a lot. I wanted to try and get some things that maybe stick in your head about who we are. And just thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren, who will introduce our presenter. Thank you.
Omega's founder and Chief Clinical Officer, Dr. Kardaras, has spent almost 20 years in New York helping thousands of young people and adults to overcome their mental health and or addiction challenges as they discover their true potential. At Omega Recovery, Austin will have one of the most cutting-edge and powerful therapeutic programs in the country, designed by one of America's leading clinicians and a thought leader in addiction treatment. Dr. Kardaras is an Ivy League educated psychologist and internationally renowned speaker and one of the country's foremost addiction experts. A former clinical professor at Stony Brook Medicine, where he specialized in treating the neurophysiology and treatment of addiction. He has also taught neuropsychology at the doctoral level and has worked closely in developing clinical protocols with Dr. Howard Schaefer, associate professor at Harvard Medical School and the director of their division of addiction. He has appeared on ABC's 2020, Good Morning America, the CBS Evening News, Fox and Friends, NPR, Good Day, New York, and has written about addiction for Time Magazine, Scientific American, Psychology Today, Salon, the New York Daily News, and Fox News, and has been featured in Esquire, New York Magazine, Vice, and Vanity Fair, etc. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Dr. Kardaras.
Well, let me lower the bar right now. Let me just comment on the show. I really want to thank y'all for being here. I am I'm a native New Yorker, and so I've only been in Austin now for the last little under a year, a few months now, and I've felt a lot of welcoming and warmth, and it's been really just great to connect with I'm a therapist. I've been a therapist now for almost 20 years. I've been in long-term sustain. I just celebrated a recovery anniversary 3 days ago. I've got almost 20 years clean and sober, personal sobriety myself, and I've been a therapist for a year less than that, so I got into the field early on in my struggle, and I had the opportunity, my life's passion became to save my life and to help some other folks get to the life road as well. And my sponsor recommended to me, you ought to go back to school and get yourself some training and maybe help other people clinically. So it's a real pleasure for me to move out to Austin with my wife and with my kids and really lead this team that I am so proud of. To echo what Anthony said, I like to think we've collected a group of people that come from integrity and are well trained and are caring, and just really proud of the team. And to join with David Naylor, who had this vision a few years ago, and I had my vision in New York. And I will tell you, New York has a lot of progressive treatments, but it is not friendly to agencies and to therapists sometimes. It's a very bureaucratically onerous system, and I was teaching at a university for about 10 years. I was running a rehab in New York, and it was not the vision that I had. I had not a 7-year itch, I had a 10-year itch, and in talking to David and exploring what we could do here in Austin, it felt right to create something special here. And so that's the Omega Recovery part. The tech addiction part has been my passion now. It's something that I am considered a thought leader in over the last few years because of the book that I wrote. And I think that's what most of you are here for. Most of you are here to get some information about this new digital age that we're in. And what I like to call this talk, it's really the mental health impacts of the digital age. What has this done to our mental health? Exhibit A. So let me just start by asking you a basic question. Just by show of hands, how many of you think that a screen device has the potential, not absolutely always will, but has the potential to lead to certain clinical disorders? Right, most of the people in this room. And let me ask you another way. How many of you think the opposite? How many of you think, oh, come on, what's this guy talking about? He's overstating the problem. This is just the next generation of technology. They said that about the radio. They said it about it's just the way things are. Don't be Pollyanna. The sky is not falling. How many of you think that this is a little overstated? Not that big of a deal. I'm preaching to the choir. Okay. And the reality of it is, and we'll go over in this talk, we're going to go over some of the clinical impacts, neurological impacts, developmental impacts, because they are significant. And I think a lot of us intuitively, how many of you also by show of hands are parents as well? A lot of you, right. I got my little duo sitting over there as well. So a lot of people that I've given this talk all over the country and all over the world have had the opportunity to give this talk. And people who are clinicians are listening with one ear as a therapist and the other ear as a parent, if you're a parent, because let's face it, we're all struggling with this. And let's face it, in the last 10 years, the landscape of our culture and our society has changed seismically. We have changed fundamentally as a species, as a byproduct of the digital age. The way we think, the way we process information, the way our brain works, the way we interpersonally interact, we have fundamentally changed as a species in the blink of an eye, 10 years, which in evolutionary terms is nothing. As a byproduct of this, and now let's face it, look at this. This is a really amazing device. I mean, on an objective level, technology and screen technology is phenomenal. In the palm of our hands, we literally have all the accumulated wisdom of the world. More wisdom than the Library of Alexandria exists through this portal. I can literally access all the information at my fingertips. So on the technical level, this is incredible. It's an incredible piece of technology, but unfortunately, I think a lot of us were sort of spellbound by that. The shiny bauble really kept us so captivated that we didn't see some of the obvious downsides of this amazing bit of technology. And so I first became aware, I'll take a step back. I first became aware about 10 years ago, I first became aware of the potential problems of the screen device. About 10 years ago, I was in my practice, and I had a young man that was about 16 years old that was sent to my office, and he had a torn Metallica t-shirt, and he was very disoriented. He was blinking really hard, and he would walk into my office looking up and down, blinking, looking around, and I kept asking him, do you know where you are? Do you know where you are? And he wasn't answering for about a minute and a half. He was suffering from derealization, which a lot of you may know. He didn't know where he was. We used to talk about substance-induced derealization, the proverbial bad acid trip. And I asked him again, do you know where you are? And finally he blinked and he said, are we still in the game? And so he had what we've come to know as a video game psychotic episode, where he had been playing World of Warcraft for about 10 hours a day. And after a few weeks of sleep deprivation and immersive gaming, he had blurred the lines where the game ended and where the real world began. And so he was literally in the Matrix. So he was literally in the Matrix, and unfortunately that young man had to be sent to a psychiatric hospital for a month, where he was put on antipsychotic medications problematically, because he did not have very good outcomes of those psychiatric meds. And that was my first aha moment that this is a strange new phenomenon. I've never seen up until that point video game psychosis. I had seen substance-induced psychosis, crystal meth psychosis, cocaine psychosis, LSD psychosis, but not a screen experience causing that kind of a psychiatric issue. And that young man had no family history of psychiatric disorders. That young man had no other telltale signs of a problem. It seemed to be a direct result of his deeming that led to that psychiatric hospitalization. So that was where my 10-year journey into beginning to study this, because I was an addiction psychologist, right? And I was working with folks that had dual diagnosis, and I was working with a lot of young adolescents. I've worked with over 1,500 teenagers over the last 15 years, because my career has been teaching, running rehabs, and doing school district work. So I did a lot of school district work with a lot of teenagers and began to see this phenomenon, and then I started studying it, writing about it, working with it clinically. So in this talk, I want to give some hopefully interesting information and really kind of get to the meat of the matter for you all as therapists, because I do think it's a comorbid issue now. The World Health Organization has now finally included in the latest ICD-11, the ICD-11 now has gaming disorders an official diagnosis, and a lot of the folks that we work with, either on the addiction side of the fence or on the mental health side of the fence, screen devices are what I call amplifiers. So they tend to amplify it for vulnerable populations. Things like anxiety, depression, ADHD effects are amplified, and psychotic effects. We've seen people that have had reality blurring through realization. So as clinicians, I think we need to be more informed as to what role, when we're doing an assessment with our clients, what's their screen usage? Because I've worked with a lot of psychiatrists and clinicians, and they're looking at the, they're holding the trunk of the elephant, they're looking at the tusk, and they're not really sort of assessing maybe what's amplifying the psychiatric distress is their screen usage. And oftentimes we've seen that that's been part of the issue. So my hope is to help sort of raise some awareness about that during this talk, and we'll have some conversations about that. So I do want to kind of go into a little bit of the, how kind of this began, our screen culture. First, a little bit of levity. So here, kids today, man, 197 square miles of the real world, and that's kind of the joke. Kind of the joke is that now kids, and look, we've all seen them, right? That was the title of my book, Glow Kids. Kids that are staring at their screen. And when did this happen? How did this happen? At what point did outdoor kids become indoor kids? It's become sort of a joke, but this happened over time, and there's been a narrative, and I'll talk about that. But about 1996, I want to go back to a cover of Newsweek that showed an optimistic view of technology. So back in 1996, here you have sort of a Norman Rockwell picture of what technology represented. Can PCs make your kid a better student? Now, I was a kid raised on Star Trek. I will self-disclose, I wanted to be William Shatner, Captain Kirk. I'm dating myself, but I loved what technology represented in Star Trek, because it was a utopian view of technology. It was no need for money, we were going to have this sort of diverse world. Kirk and Spock were so cool. I wanted the future of technology to be a good thing. And obviously, so did Newsweek at a certain point. And then Newsweek, 16 years later, had a very different cover story. In 2012, here we have the realities of our screen culture. Panic, depression, psychosis. How connection addiction is rewiring our brains. Now I want you to look at that young man's face. A big byproduct or big impact of screen culture has been sensory overload. And let's face it, some of us as adults have gotten it as well, right? And part of my talk, I do focus on young people, but it's applicable to adults. It's just that children are more vulnerable to these effects. Children are more developmentally vulnerable, they're more clinically vulnerable. But how many of you have experienced information overload in the last 10 years? Because now we're always plugged into work, we always have to text, email, and be online. And there's a sense of kind of what that kid's doing. And what happens to us clinically when we have information overload? I'll talk about there are certain adrenal impacts, what it does to our adrenal system, what it does to our neurochemistry, what it does to us as human beings. It's pretty impactful. The I think one of the things that had happened that made us asleep at the switch in terms of what may have been some of these negative clinical impacts is that people of my generation, and you know, some of you are my generation, some of you are a little younger, I'm 54, but people 35 and over, I think equivocated modern screens with television. I think that was the fundamental mistake. A lot of us said, well look, we were raised on television, we kind of turned out all right, not kind of. But modern screens are qualitatively different than that old rabbit-eared television of yesteryear. Qualitatively different for two fundamental reasons. What does somebody want to guess? What are the two main reasons that make a modern screen, a portable screen, let's say an iPad, different than that old black and white television in our living room? What makes it more impactful psychologically and neurologically? Who wants to take a stab at it?
Unlimited. TV used to stop and turn off and off.
Right, so there's a ubiquity quality to it. Right. So our screens are ubiquitous, so they're in our pocket. We couldn't put that old black and white TV in our closet. Hopefully we couldn't put it in our back pocket. So there's a ubiquity to it that makes it sort of nonstop. But the main feature is modern screens are immersive and interactive. So when we watched television 20 or 30 years ago, it was a passive viewing experience. I sat there and I watched Starsky and Hutch, right? But I wasn't in it. I had a distance and a psychological distance from it. Now the experience is in it. You are in Grand Theft Auto. You are in the social media experience. So modern screens, because of their immersive and interactive nature, have a much more psychologically and neurologically impactful effect on who we are as human beings, primarily because of that. So this and the phone is not the same as television was 20 or 30 years ago. So subsequently we've created this. And I don't mean, I do hear it, make light of it, but we are undergoing an adolescent millennial mental health epidemic. Adolescent suicide rates have doubled in the social media age. ADHD rates are over 100% higher than what they used to be, because I'm going to talk very clearly about the attentional impacts of modern screen culture. Depression is skyrocketing. Anxiety rates are skyrocketing. Young people are at the worst point in their mental health than in our history. So if you work with anybody from 14 to 25, you better be versed in some of the screen impacts, because they are an amplifier. There is a reason why our kids and young people are in a mental health crisis. And there's a couple of statistics that we talked about. So USA Today, youth suicides are rising, the internet may be to blame. The CDC found the suicide rates for children aged 10 to 14 have doubled from 2007 to 2014. Same time, social media usage surged. By the way, pediatric suicide is a statistic now. Almost never used to exist. There used to be every 3 or 4 years a 7 or an 8-year-old suicide. Now it's a statistic. Now there are about 15 to 25, 5 to 10-year-olds a year that kill themselves. That's a new phenomenon. And I posit that a big part of that pediatric suicide and the adolescent suicide spike is a direct correlation to our screen culture. We're going to talk a little bit about social media. How does a young person define themselves? What's my self-concept? My self-concept used to be intrinsically informed. Now it's extrinsically based on shares and likes and Instagram. And if in the old days, if I got bullied by 5 kids, now I get cyberbullied by 5,000 kids. More impactful or less impactful? I've worked with adolescent females who have also been sent to the psych hospital because of suicidal attempts. Again, all or oftentimes amplified by their social media usage. So these are all things that we have to really take into account. Suicide overtook motor vehicle accidents as a cause of death in that age group. Now here's a really interesting statistic, this last one. I really want you to focus in on this one. Teens' use of electronic devices for at least 5 hours daily have more than doubled, from 8% in 2009 to 19% in 2015. But those teens were 70% more likely to have suicidal thoughts or actions than those who reported an hour of daily use. Now think about that. If I'm a teenager and I'm on the screen for 5 hours, I'm 70%. I mean, that's, those of you that do research, Kimberly, where are you, Kim?
I'm right here.
Is that a statistically significant number? We're not talking 5%, 8%, 70% more likely to have suicidal ideations or attempts if you're on the screen 5 hours versus 1 hour. So what about this device makes me want to kill myself? And that's the question we need to ask. What about being on this damn thing makes a young person want to kill themselves so much more significantly than those people who are not on the screen? So the teenage and adolescent epidemic is causing our young people to basically say this. They're in crisis. Now we focus, and justifiably, on the opioid epidemic. We have 115 people a day dying of opioid overdoses. But it's, when a lot of times when we talk about substance use and abuse, I talk about we're looking at the telescope through the wrong end. Because let's face it, it's not they used to say it's not guns that kill people, it's not the opioids that are necessary. I mean, yes, there's a problem with overprescription and everything else, but why are people in such distress and such pain and such interior distress that they're reaching out for escape? The real issue is why are young people escaping as much as they are? And you could escape through a pill and you could escape through this. These are both forms of escape. So I do want to give a little bit of contextual, historical perspective as to when our screen culture began to swallow up children. And because it wasn't just 10 years ago. There were a couple of things that happened culturally that a lot of sociologists have pointed to as the development of when outdoor children became indoor children. Right? How many of you, and I'm sure those of you that are younger, when I was a kid, we played outside from sunrise to sunset. Now, Johnny and Susie are in the bedroom day and night. When did that happen? It wasn't just when the iPad came out in 2010. It began a little before then. Yeah, anybody remember this kid? Remember Eitan Pates? How many of you remember Eitan Pates? I got a couple of takes in the room. Okay. Eitan Pates was the first, he wasn't the first missing kid, because kids have been abducted since time immemorial, but he was the first really high-profile missing child. Yeah, Eitan Pates in 1979 in New York. His father was a photographer. It was the first day that his mom and dad let him walk to the bus stop by himself. 2 blocks away from their house in Soho, and Eitan wanted to walk to the bus stop by himself. 2 blocks. They never saw Eitan again. And it became a national news story. The missing kid. It was the first kid on the side of a milk carton, and all of a sudden, parents had their oh shit moment. And we gotta pull our kids tighter because there are bad people out there. Now there had been child abductions, as I said, for decades or hundreds of years, but they didn't get the media exposure. And right around the same time that Eitan Pates was abducted, we had this happening. You guys remember Ted Turner? 1980 was the advent of 24/7 news. And 24/7 news means you gotta fill up a lot of airtime. And you gotta report every kid that falls down the well. You've gotta report every you've got a lot of time to fill. Because before CNN and before Fox and before MSNBC, you had Walter Cronkite, and you had the 3 networks for half an hour a day. And that was the news. And then you had the local newspaper. So you didn't know about every kid that disappeared in, South Dakota or in Europe, but 24/7 news, high-profile abduction, and now parents became more frightened. And this was the onset of what would become the parent helicopter movement. So parents that now started saying, I'm afraid for my child to walk outside or to play outside as much, because their bad boogeymen out there started keeping their kids indoors, and you started having the advent of the indoor child. And the indoor child started with television, as you can see by our young, bright-eyed young man to the left. And being amplified by the kid with a different glowing screen to the right. But as I mentioned earlier, that screen to the right is much, much, much more impactful than that screen to the left. A couple of other things also. There was a researcher and a professor that began to warn about the growing development of screen technologies and how that was going to shape the way that we think and the way that we are as a human species. And that guy's name was Neil Postman. Neil Postman was an NYU professor who wrote a seminal book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And Neil Postman basically analogized screen technology as our Brave New World Soma, digital Soma he called it, or electronic Soma. And you guys remember Brave New World and Soma? Soma was the drug that was going to kind of anesthetize the masses. And Neil Postman, back in 1985, compared media like TV to that Brave New World, and he said that we're going to become a society of uninformed pleasure seekers. He also said visual media would also impact how we think and process information. Reading required in-depth rational analysis and led to dialectical discourse. TV did not. And he also was vehemently opposed to the personal computer because he thought that education should be a Socratic group process, not individualized kid in front of a PC. But basically, Neil Postman's fundamental issue was not only was this going to be the new drug that sedates us, and he did ascribe some geopolitical aspects to it. Now, I'm an addiction psychologist, and I learned early on in my training that substances have a certain social component or political component to them. That during the times of slavery, some of you may or may not know, that every adult male slave used to get a bottle of moonshine every Saturday. Now, why did a young male slave get a bottle of moonshine from the plantation owner every Saturday? Because they worked really hard all week? What was the purpose of giving young males a bottle of moonshine? What is a drunk slave as opposed to a sober slave?
They won't revolt.
You're not going to raise your head up and revolt. You're not going to educate yourself. You're not going to organize. You're not going to move up in your life. A sedated person, a drunk person, an addicted person is less likely to get a college education, less likely to move forward in their lives. So sedation, or a person that's not fully engaged in their life, is a much more malleable, controlled population. So some people argue that that's what happened during the heroin epidemic, the post-Vietnam War heroin epidemic of the 70s, the crack epidemic of the 1980s, and I posit that there's a big part of that going on right now with digital sedation. I've worked with young people who literally could not tell you who the president is. Literally could not tell you who the president is because they're so consumed by the gaming or the social media that they're sedated by this glowing screen, and they do not know the larger geopolitical context of their world. So there is that potential aspect of it as well. And the other part of it with technology is that there is this notion that the more we become dependent on our machines, the more we recede as a human species. And there was some interesting research that backs some of that up. We've outsourced our memory. Just real quick show of hands. How many of you can name 10 phone numbers of your 10 closest friends or family members? Who wants to do it? Who can recite 10 phone numbers? Well, 15 years ago, the average person was able to recite 10 phone numbers. You knew your family's phone numbers, your friends' phone numbers, because guess what? You memorized them. Now I've outsourced my memory to this. We know that memory is a muscle in the hippocampus that keeps developing throughout lifetime. And I'll tell you about an interesting study about that. And memory kind of is you lose it, use it or lose it. If we don't use our memory, it atrophies. And an interesting study that showed how memory keeps developing throughout lifetime was at University College of London. How many of you know about London cab drivers and this famous test that they have to take? So there's this really notorious exam called the knowledge. If you want to pass, if you want to get licensed as a cab driver in London, you have to study for several years, and London has 25,000 labyrinthine, obscure streets. And so it's a memorization process. You've got to memorize, because there's no system to it. You've got to memorize about 25,000 various streets to pass this test. Well, these folks at the University College of London, they did an MRI test on about 100 plus folks that were going to take this exam. And they did an MRI before they prepared, and then they These folks studied for 3 years using their memory, and then they did an MRI on the folks who passed the exam. The folks who passed the exam, and they were older, 30s, 40s, and 50s, their hippocampus grew. It was like a hippocampus on steroids. And the hippocampus is the main part of the brain devoted to memory. So people that used their memory in adulthood developed stronger memory muscles. Use it or lose it. But are we using our memories or are we not using them? The other interesting study was about pilots' abilities, pilots who flew by wire. And pilots oftentimes, as you know, I mean, some of you who fly a lot, you know, a lot of times your pilots are, you know, they're checking Facebook, I mean, the plane is flying itself essentially. And pilots who fly by wire more, their own flying skills erode. And they did a study at the University of Cranfield where they studied pilots. The pilots had to land a plane in bad weather manually. And, you know, well, you know the end of the story. The ones who flew by wire more were more incompetent, and the ones who actually flew the plane on their own had better piloting skills. So it's this idea that technology can atrophy our own abilities oftentimes. So that's a little bit about that. So part of what we're going to talk about now is some of these clinical tech effects that we've talked about: addiction, ADHD, aggression, anxiety, depression, and psychosis. And the first one I want to really get into is addiction. And Dr. Peter Wybrow was the director of neuroscience at UCLA. He was the first one a few years back that used the term electronic cocaine. And my friend Dr. Andrew Doan, he was the head of research for the US Navy and the Pentagon. He started calling screens digital pharmakia, the Greek word for drug. And Chinese researchers have been using the word digital heroin for many years. I wrote an article for the New York Post called Digital Heroin that went viral with over 6 million views. By the way, this Sunday's New York Post, I have a follow-up to that. If you go online to the New York Post, those of you that like the New York Post. And so digital heroin sort of I became known as the guy that about 2 years ago started talking about screens as being a drug. And, you know, and some people challenged that notion. Some people sort of got, is it really like a drug? And of course, again, I'm a recovering opiate addict. I'm not minimizing the impacts of heroin, but I'm also acknowledging or trying to raise awareness that this has the addictive potential of a drug. And in fact, the article that I wrote about for this Sunday was a shocking, to me it was some shocking information that I'd gotten. Last summer, I got an email from, she was the clinical director of the Air Force. The Air Force has mental health providers that provide PTSD, all sorts of services for their folks. So I was asked to be the keynote speaker for the Air Force's mental health conference in Tampa. So they wanted me to do a screen addiction presentation, and I asked the woman via email, why do you want me to do a screen addiction presentation for the Air Force? And she said, well, Dr. K, the problem's gotten so severe here at the Air Force that in the last year, we've had so many gaming airmen, and let's face it, a lot of these soldiers and airmen are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, basically. A lot of them are either bored or have PTSD. They're all gaming at their barracks. But the problem has gotten so significant, here's the part that made my jaw drop. We've had 5 infant fatalities this year who, Air Force babies who died as a result of their fathers were gaming for so many days in a row that the baby died from neglect or maltreatment in the crib. And I said to her, wait a second, you're telling me that 5 Air Force babies died this year because their fathers were gaming addiction? She said, well, we've been trying to keep it somewhat discreet. But yes, and in fact, the problem was so severe that the Department of Defense, the DOD, had developed a new category for the death certificate called death to electronic distraction. That's what my New York Post article was about this Sunday, by the way. It's so, and as she said, so if you, by the way, if you Google World of Warcraft and adult diapers, you'll see whole chat rooms of gamers who talk about what are the best adult diapers to wear because they'll game for so many days in a row, they won't take a bathroom break, they won't eat, they won't sleep. If that's not an addiction, I don't know what is. If you don't take a bathroom break for 3 days, and if your baby's died in the crib as a result of your compulsive behavior, if that's not an addiction. When I was on Good Morning America, I was being challenged about, come on, isn't this just a hobby? Well, I don't know of stamp collectors who wear adult diapers for the campaign. This compulsion is more prominent than the average hobby. So there was an interesting article in the New York Times back in March that talked, it was fascinating, those of us that work with addiction, are teenagers replacing drugs with smartphones. And interestingly, adolescent substance abuse has skewed down for the first time in decades. Adolescent substance abuse has skewed down for the first time in decades. Wonderful. Good news, right? But what the supposition is, they've now replaced it with a new drug of choice. Now, we might say maybe it's a better trade-off, maybe this is less potentially problematic or less fatal, but what they found, and Dr. David Greenfield from UConn School of Medicine said, people are carrying around a portable dopamine pump, and kids have basically been carrying it around for the last 10 years. And Dr. Nora Balcones, the director of NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, said, teens can literally get high when playing these games. Interactive media act as an alternative reinforcer to drugs. So when we talk about how this can be drug-like, we have to begin to talk about what is addiction and what's the dopaminergic effect and what these actually do to our brains and our neurotransmitters when we're engaged in our screens. That's an important part to understand if we're really to acknowledge that this is a genuine addiction. So most of you know, dopamine is one of the brain's feel-good neurotransmitters. Now, dopamine was originally, from an evolutionary standpoint, dopamine was meant to incentivize certain life-sustaining functions. The two primary life-sustaining functions that dopamine incentivized was eating, right? When we eat, it feels good. Dopamine gets released. It incentivizes us to eat. That keeps us alive unless we overdo it. And the second one was procreation, right? When we have sex, it feels good. It's nature's way of saying, do that again. It keeps the species going. And so these are two life-sustaining functions that are dopaminergic. What substances and what screen experiences do is they hijack the dopaminergic process. There is no life-sustaining evolutionary aspect to screen experiences, yet they hijack that same, what's called the mesolimbic dopamine reward loop. We chase that dopamine high, but there's no life-sustaining payback to it. So there was an interesting study back in 1998, Dr. Koch did a study that looked at how much dopamine was raised by certain behaviors and certain experiences. So food raised dopamine levels 50%. And again, this is back in 1998, so video games and sex were 100% dopaminergic. So a 1998 video game, now a 98 video game, it's not exactly Pong, but it's not today's video games either. These are a little bit sort of more old school. If they did the study again, I would hazard to say that the dopaminergic effect would be significantly higher. But think about that. A screen video game is as arousing from a dopamine perspective as a sexual experience, and we're letting our 8-year-olds engage in those experiences. Now, what's the difference between a video game kid versus somebody that's having a sexual experience in terms of the time? I got my kids in the room, but not to be crude about it. Typically, a sexual experience is a one-off, unless you're Sting. But and a video game experience tends to be multiple hour. So you're doing that dopamine spike, and it's a plateau experience. So your dopamine is spiking hour after hour after hour after hour. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about what that does. There's an adrenal fatigue phenomenon that happens because now you're in this hyper-aroused state. And if you watch gamers, and I've worked with a lot of them, they're like this 8 hours a night, and you're not, our systems weren't meant to be hyper-stimulated like that for prolonged periods of time. So now these hyper-aroused kids begin to look like ADHD kids. They're very hypervigilant. They begin to look like PTSD kids. They begin to look like adrenally malfunctioning kids, and they get often misdiagnosed with a whole host of other disorders, put on other medications, and round those kids go down the pathology wheel. So the part that I think is important to realize is gaming experiences and social media are not addicting by accident. It's not as if, oh, you know what, it just so happened that this device became very compulsing. Dr. Doan, again, he's the Director of Addiction Research for the US Navy. The video gaming industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Video game companies will hire the best neurobiologists and neuroscientists to hook up electrodes to the test gamer. If they don't elicit a blood pressure of 180/140 within a couple of minutes of gameplay, they go back and tweak the game to get the maximum addicting and arousing response. So typically they'll hire like 17-year-old beta testers and they'll give them $100 Amazon cards and they'll hook them up to galvanic skin responses and blood pressure gauges. And then they'll have them test drive the game. Now if little Johnny doesn't get amped up to within 180/140 within 2 minutes, the designers go back and tweak the adrenaline rush of the game. Because it's all about adrenaline. It's adrenaline and dopamine. Those are two main drivers of the video game industry. And when we'll talk about it, attention, kids are getting hyper-stimulated and hyper-aroused. Well, I'll talk about this when we get to the ADHD piece. They get robbed of their ability to learn how to attend, because attention is a developmental window. And if you're getting somebody that's getting bombarded by imagery like that constantly, they don't develop their muscles for attention. And so they become now attentionally challenged young people. And attention is, unfortunately, a developmental window that's lifelong, but I'll talk about that in a second. But let me continue this dialogue of how we've been addicted and manipulated by design. And some of the main power brokers in the industry have laid out their playbook fairly recently. Sean Parker was the original president of Facebook. And if you see the movie, The Social Network, he was the, what's his name? The Justin Timberlake character, right? He was the Justin Timberlake character. But Sean Parker has had a crisis of conscience lately. Sean Parker, just a few weeks ago, came out and he's off of Facebook. He's kind of regretting what's happened. Old Sean, with $1.7 billion in the bank for Facebook stock, has had a crisis of conscience. He said, Facebook literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains. Well, God and a few neuroscientists, because we do know what it's doing to children's brains, now we're going to go into it. Facebook is designed to exploit, quote, a vulnerability in human psychology to get its users addicted. This is, again, Sean Parker. The inventors, creators, it's me, it's Mark Zuckerberg, it's Kevin Systrom on Instagram. It's all of these people understood this consciously, and we did it anyway. And then he kind of lays it out even further. The next quote kind of really explicates it a little bit more. Facebook uses likes and shares to create a social validation feedback loop. Before I talk about a dopamine reward feedback loop, we chase dopaminergic experiences because our brain is wired that way. Well, Facebook manipulates that, so every time you get a like or a share, you get a little dopamine squirt, and then you chase that. And keeps users coming back. We need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on the photo or post or whatever Parker said. And that's going to get you to continue to contribute more content. That's going to get you more likes and more comments. So social media's got this built-in addictive component. And then on 60 Minutes a few months ago, they had a very interesting expose with Anderson Cooper. It was called Brain Hacking. This was back last April. And they spoke to a former Google product manager, Tristan Harris. And he said, Silicon Valley is intentionally engineering your phone, apps, social media to get you hooked. There's a whole playbook of techniques that get used to get you using the product for as long as possible. Every time I check my phone, I'm playing the slot machine to see what did I get. This is one way to hijack people's minds and create a habit, to form a habit. And finally, Anderson Cooper asked, you're almost saying like there's an addiction code. Yeah, that is the case. That since we figured out to some extent how these pieces of the brain that handle addiction are working, people have figured out how to juice them further, how to bake the information into the apps. Not an accident. Multi-billion dollars and some of the top neuropsychologists have been hired to get us hooked as a society. And again, if we as adults have developed unhealthy relationships with our technology, what chance does the 10-year-old who's less developmentally equipped than we are to just say no, or to only use the device for half an hour a day? This was by design. Hook 'em young, hook 'em for life. Same thing with the tobacco industry in the 1950s, same thing with drug dealers, no difference. I want to illustrate, because I got turned on to something a few months ago that really hit home for how powerful of a drug-like effect a screen can be. So the US military began researching the use of games as a digital analgesic for pain management. And actually my friend Dr. Andrew Doan at the Navy turned me on to this research. So veterans coming back from combat from Iraq or Afghanistan who were burn victims, and some of you who may know, if you're a burn victim, the most painful part about being a burn victim is the daily wound care. They have to, every day, take off a bandage, and they have to do what's called debridement. You have to scrub the burns. Excruciatingly painful, and usually these poor burn victims have to get put on high doses of morphine. Invariably, they become hooked on morphine and become morphine addicts. They found, these two University of Washington researchers, that if a burn victim was playing a virtual reality game called Snow World, during their burn treatment, they needed no pain pills. They felt no pain. And in fact, just to show you what it looked like, that's a veteran burn victim, and that's his nurse doing his daily wound care, and that's him playing Snow World. They did MRIs on their brains while playing Snow World, and the parts of the brain devoted to pain, were more activated than with actual morphine. The screen experience was more powerful than literal morphine. And just to see what the game looked like, by the way, this is what the game looks like. You throw snowballs at the little penguins while little Paul Simon music plays in the background. It's kind of like a happy, it's not even like Grand Theft Auto, it's like a happy little game, but it's so immersive that it arouses the pain management part of your brain. Now folks, that's an amazing use of technology for pain management. Dr. Flowers would be thrilled about this because it actually can help with pain management. But my narrative has been, if it's so powerful on parts of the brain that are related to our pain, what is this digital morphine doing to the 8-year-old who's using this for hours a day? We don't have any longitudinal studies to show what's happening to the brain of a kid who's playing a more immersive game than this. So before I talked about some of the brain physiological effects and also some of the adrenal effects. And there was some interesting research that showed that actual screen experiences can change your brain physiology. And I like this particular study that was done at the University of Indiana's Medical School, because this study did a pre and post MRI test, and it showed basically what happens. This was a group of young folks that were not gamers, so we got a baseline MRI, and then what happens when they played 10 hours of a violent video game, 10 hours a week for 2 weeks. Now 10 hours a week of gaming, for those of you who are parents of gamers, that's like nothing. That's like, some kids can do that in half a day. Their brains changed. 2 weeks. The brains changed. Now, there are two fundamental, the main way that the brain was impacted by screens is almost exactly the same way that substances affect the brain. The frontal cortex, which is that part of our brain behind our forehead, the executive functioning part of our brain, the part of our brain that controls impulse control, decision making, consequential thinking. Well, we know that chronic drug abuse compromises the frontal cortex. Literally what it does is it makes, it's called the DGM, the dense gray matter of our frontal cortex becomes less dense. Essentially, the frontal cortex shrinks with drug abuse. Same thing happens with screen addiction. When you looked at the brains, and Dr. Wang was the lead researcher, for the first time, we found that a sample of randomly assigned young adults showed less activation in certain frontal brain regions following a week of playing violent video games at home. The affected brain regions are important for controlling emotion and aggressive behavior. The frontal brain regions are also the same brain regions that are affected by drug addiction. For the first time, researchers showed a direct relationship between playing violent video games and a subsequent change in those brain regions associated with executive functioning. And this is what it looked like. The bottom 3 slides are the game plan. Now, orange, the more orange you see, the more activated. That's a good thing. The more orange shows that that brain is activated. So this bottom right quadrant, that's the gaming brain after 2 weeks. It's dulled. It's no longer the important frontal and medial cortex parts of the brain have been deactivated. And that's, again, just after a 2-week period. What happens after 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years? And then there have been several other studies that have done brain imaging that have showed similar effects, and I list some of these. So I don't want to bore you with some of those details. I do want to talk a little bit about the adrenal effect that I talked about. I remember before I talked about somebody that's on the screen for hours and they're amped up and their adrenaline surging. Well, that person tends to look a little bit like this kid. So look at little Johnny, look what's happening with him. He's so amped. And he's amped like that for, again, an extended period of time, not just for 5 or 10 minutes. So what happens? So when a kid like that is engaged in a really hyper-stimulating, hyper-arousing screen experience, it affects what's called as HPA. The HPA is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. That's a fancy 25-cent phrase that just means your fight or flight response. So little Johnny's fight or flight response is in hyper mode. And what happens is if you do that for hour after hour, again, evolutionarily, we weren't designed to have our HPA activated for so long. Typically, when our HPA, our fight or flight response kicks in, it's usually some kind of threat in our environment, right? We're walking through the Kalahari, the lion pops out, our adrenaline surges, and all that adrenaline, all the fight or flight response is adrenaline. It's adrenaline usually surges to the hands to fight, to the feet to run, to the heart to pump. And by the way, those of you that work with anxiety, you know that that's what anxiety is. Anxiety is sort of the hijacked fight or flight response. It's a misguided adrenaline surging response. So a lot of these gamers now have had their adrenaline thermostat turned on high for too long. And now that thermostat is not easily turned back down to baseline. So now little Johnny, let's look at him again. This kid, let's say he's been up from 6 o'clock at night till 1 o'clock in the morning. Now he's got to go to school at 8 a.m. How do you think he's going to look like in the classroom? Calm and sipping his green tea? This kid is much more likely to now get diagnosed because he's going to be like this in class. ADHD, we got to send him for an evaluation. Maybe he's got to get an IEP. Now he's going to get tracked with certain other disorders potentially. And what might be happening is he might just be overstimulated. And Victoria Dunkley, so we also call the dysregulation effect. Children can't calm down and are wired and tired. Dr. Dunkley calls this electronic screen syndrome, and it can look like ADHD, moodiness, and aggressive behavior. Dr. Dunkley is a colleague of mine. She's a psychiatrist in Los Angeles. She's worked with screening issues for the last 10 years. She's seen over 1,000 kids and teenagers, and she will not diagnose or prescribe a young person unless they unplug for 4 weeks. So you go to her practice and you think little Johnny's got ADHD or conduct disorder, even spectrum disorders. Unplug him for 4 weeks, then bring him back, and then let's see what we have. And anecdotally, she's told me that fully 70% of the times, no symptoms after 4 weeks. That just unplugging, just taking away the stimulant calms the child down. But typically it takes about 4 weeks. Typically it takes about 4 weeks for that child's adrenal system to reset to baseline. So yeah, this is, again, I talked about Victoria Dunkley. The other part that we haven't talked about is that children who are actively engaged with screening experiences get very sleep dysregulated. And those of you also who know about sleep hygiene as adults, right? We've talked about having no screens by the bed, not having a screen experience for at least a couple of hours before you go to bed, because again, the screen dysregulates and affects our circadian sleep cycles. So if you're not getting good sleep and you're watching or you're playing Grand Theft Auto 10 minutes before bedtime, or even just watching a movie that's a little bit too, like if you're watching Liam Neeson's Taken an hour before bedtime, you're not going to sleep well. It's amplified with children. So I did want to talk about ADHD. Dimitri Christakis was the main researcher that looked at screen effects of ADHD, and originally, back in 2010, well, back back in 2004, I'm going to go to the bottom statistic first. He found that for every hour of television screen time between the ages of 2 and 6, a child had a 10% higher rate of ADHD. So if your 2 or 3-year-old watched 3 hours of television, there were 30% more likely to have ADHD. They did that same research in 2010 with immersive and interactive screens, and the effect was significantly amplified. Now I want you to think about attention for a minute. Attention, like language, is a developmental window, right? We know that if a person doesn't learn language between a key developmental window, let's say between the ages of 2 and 10, your ability to access language becomes permanently compromised. So we know that feral children that have never been exposed to language, when they found some of these kids when they were 13 or 14, they sometimes were able to learn basic language, but never idiomatic language or metaphor. The language window closes. Well, attention is like that, right? So kids develop their ability to focus and pay attention when they're playing with blocks. Hand-eye coordinating things are helping a child develop their focus and attention. What stunts a child's attention is being passively overstimulated. And they've done MRI research on this as well. So a child that's getting overstimulated by screen experience, now their synaptic muscles devoted to attention atrophy. Now the child becomes dependent on stimulation to keep their focus. Absent the stimulation, the child's attention wanders. And we've all seen those kids, right? They're like this, put the screen in front of them, and they zombie out, take the screen away, and they go like that again. They become dependent on stimulation. That becomes, unfortunately, and I've worked with over 1,000 teenagers. Those kids that I've worked with that were screen-raised kids from 2 or 3 years old, it's their wiring now. Now they need that stimulation. It also, what we don't talk about enough, is what it does to their creativity. Children, we talk about active imagination, creative play. That also builds their neurosynaptic muscles the most, in the best possible way. A child that is forced to just be bored and create, that's building their brain muscles. But somehow we're uncomfortable about that as parents. We feel that we have to keep our children constantly stimulated. So, we stick screens in front of our children because we think somehow that that's somehow beneficial for our children. We've bought the false narrative that screens are educational. Our child is learning. But I want you to think about even the basic screen experience from 30 or 40 years ago. Think about Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, God bless Mr. Rogers. Zip, shoes on. Think about the pacing of that show. Trolley would come out. That show was one long, focused, attentional experience. Think about modern kids' television. In the 1950s, they called that the startle effect. When television first became prominent, they figured out that the adult average attention span, we had about 15 minutes. Most of us had about 15 minutes of engaged attention, and then we begin to fade out, and that's when the commercial would come, and then they would do a startle effect right before the commercial to kind of wake us up and go to the bathroom or do whatever. And then they realized that as time went on, the startle effect, that our attention spans began to get more compromised. So the startle effect happened then after 12 minutes, and then 10 minutes, and then 9 minutes, and 8 minutes. And now, if you watch some movies and programming, it is one big startle effect. If you watch even a movie from the 1970s, in terms of, watch 2001: The Space Odyssey, and look at how slow the pacing is of that movie compared to a modern day movie. That reflects our ability, again, to attend. We've been so hyper-stimulated, we don't have the attention span for that. But now think about children who have been robbed of their ability to develop their attention span. They don't even have the ability to focus even if they wanted to. And from a creativity standpoint, our children have not been nurtured to create their own interior imagery. We've programmed our children with extrinsic imagery, so their ability to create imagery is atrophied. So what do I mean by that? I like to do this little thought experiment with those of us of a certain age. How many of you remember MTV when they used to show music videos? Before it was the reality television. Okay, so think of a song that you've heard of that you've not seen a music video for. Okay, think of a song that you've not seen a music video for. Who wants to volunteer? Somebody jump in the water. Who wants? Okay. Where? Okay, so what's the song?
Islands in the Stream by Dolly Parton.
Okay, so when you think of that song, what comes to mind?
Well, okay, so no, I guess I have, because I've seen her singing on stage with Kenny Rogers.
Okay, so that comes to mind.
Yes.
Who's can think of a song that they've never seen an image? Okay, go ahead.
If You Were the Woman and I Was the Man,
Okay.
by Cowboy Junkies.
And what comes to mind when you think of that song?
My husband and I walking on the beach.
Okay. Now, is that your own intrinsic video? Did you make that video?
Yes.
Okay. So your brain associates that music with that personal visual imagery. Now think, the rest of you, think of a song that you've seen the music video for. What comes to mind? The music video. We can't uncouple it. Once you've seen the video and the song, bing, the video pops into our brain. It is become programmed. Now times that effect by 1,000 for our children, because our children have had such high-level imagery drilled into their brains from the time that they've been infants with screen imagery. And what that screen imagery does that's been so programmed into kids' brains is it atrophies their natural ability to create their own imagery. So when I work with young kids who have been raised on screens and I ask them, write me a story, draw me a picture, stimulate me, they're just looking for stimulation. They don't have the intrinsic ability to formulate imagery or creativity because it's atrophied. So that's an underappreciated effect of hyperstimulating imagery. We know also that I don't think it comes as a news flash for a lot of therapists who were versed with social learning theory, but we know that we model, right? We are social animals and we model after monkey see, monkey do. And we also know that screen experiences are also experiences that we can model after. So does it come as a shock that the research from Iowa State, mostly it's Iowa State and Dr. Craig Anderson, who's done the aggression research for video games, but there's 30 years of research that shows the more violent content that a kid watches, the more prone they are to be aggressive. It should have come as a news flash. I mean, the video game industry denies this, by the way, so they deny that there's any link to aggressive behavior with violent screen imagery, but the research is pretty clear on this. 130 research studies, over 130,000 participants, and then in the APA Journal Psychological Bulletin, they talked about not just a correlation, but a causal risk factor for increased aggressive thoughts and behavior. And we have about 10 instances of young adolescent males that have committed matricide or patricide when their game devices were taken away from them. They killed their mothers or fathers when they had their game devices taken away. I've studied those 10 cases. 2 of them, the kids had some psychiatric issues. In the other 8 cases, the kids were fairly normalized. And it was like a drug addict having their drug taken away. They had explosive, violent episodes. The one more prominent one was this young man, Dan Petrick, who was profiled on NBC. His father on the bottom was the town pastor. That was his mom. Dan had not been a gamer. Dan had been raised pretty traditionally, and he had gotten into a snowboard accident, and he had broke his leg. So he had been homeschooled for a period of a few weeks while his leg healed, and his buddy got him a game box, and he started playing the game Halo. Within 2 weeks, he started playing Halo 18 hours a day. His father got justifiably concerned and took away his game box, took away Halo, and locked him in the lockbox. Well, Dan went into his father's bedroom, took his father's lockbox, broke into it, took out the Halo and the Game Boy, and also found his father's gun, and went into his parents' bedroom and said, "Mom and Dad, I've got a surprise for you," and shot both of them. His mother died, his father survived, the gunshot went to the face. When he had shot them, his sister was just coming to visit with her husband, and they were going to watch the Cleveland Indians baseball game. And Dan tried to shoo her away and said, "Mom and Dad are arguing, get out." But the sister at the front door heard the father moaning from the bedroom. So she pushed him aside, went into the bedroom, saw the carnage. And so Dan made a break for it. He went to the family van, she called the police surrounded the house, and when they arrested Dan, guess who was riding, what was riding shotgun with Dan? the Xbox and Halo. He had just killed his mother, and all he thought to bring was his video games. So he's serving, I think, 24 to life right now. They interviewed him on, I think Oprah talked to his father not too long. His father's forgiven him from while he's in jail. He's been in jail for about 7 years now, and you know, he seems like a fairly thoughtful young man now, and he regrets what he's done and everything else. But an example of what can happen when you're immersed, and he did talk about that in the game. When you killed someone, you press reset and everybody comes back to life, and how that had blurred his sense of what was real death or not real death. The other very high-profile case that I think was very prominent about violence and school shootings with video gaming was this guy. So Adam Lanza, the Newtown shooter. Now, admittedly, this young man had some pre-existing psychiatric issues. He was on the spectrum. He had severe OCD that he'd been treated for since he was 12 in New Haven. I've read every word from the Attorney General, Connecticut Attorney General's report about this case. It's obvious to me that this young man was in full-blown video game psychosis when he committed his acts of violence that day at Newtown. He had been playing, essentially his mother pulled him out of school when he was 14 or 15 because the school couldn't provide him enough services because he had some special needs. So essentially when his mother pulled him out of school, he went and he lived in the basement and played video games day and night. But he wasn't just playing any video games. He was playing a game called Modern Warfare 2, where it's a game where you're a civilian shooter going into an airport and you're shooting women and children, and it's very realistic. So the women, so there's headshots, you bleed out, you shoot people while they're crawling away in blood. He was also playing a game called School Shooter. There's a game called School Shooter where the player goes classroom to classroom shooting students. So this young, psychiatrically unstable, vulnerable young man was playing a game called School Shooter, and the one FBI report that I read said this was a gamer trying to achieve high score. He went to an elementary school because he was shooting fish in a barrel. They found, post-mortem, they found in his bedroom an 8-foot sheet long paper that had every serial killer with a point total next to it. And it had his name. He was trying to be high score. And the other reason why the FBI investigator concluded that he was a gamer trying to get high score was when the police surrounded him, he shot himself rather than allowing the police to shoot him. And in gaming culture, if you get shot by another player, you lose your points. But if you shoot yourself, you keep your points. So the debate about guns is a valid one, but we barely talked about what shaped or what pushed this young man over the edge. And again, I think his game, it's undeniable that his gaming life had a big part of that. Briefly with social media, so social media, it's sort of a funny thing, right? We're hardwired social animals. We are hardwired to connect. We know from research that without social connection, we get emotionally and psychologically ill, or we get physically ill. People in isolation do not do well. They've done long-term isolation studies with NASA, and they know that people in isolation, we need social connection. So you would think that when a social animal gets together with something called social media, you would think it'd be like peanut butter and chocolate coming together. You would think it'd be phenomenal and that our mental health should be flourishing in the social media age. But in fact, we're finding the opposite. We're finding that social media is having the opposite effect, that our mental health is suffering in the social media age. By 2020, depression is going to be the #2 chronic debilitating illness. Depression is skyrocketing in the social media age. In fact, 3 separate studies showed what's called the Facebook depression effect, that literally the more friends you have on Facebook, the higher the incidence of you having depression is. So more Facebook friends, more likely that you're going to be depressed, and that was attributed to what was called the comparison effect. So who wants to speculate what happens with the comparison? Why would Facebook get anyone depressed? Who wants to take a shot at it?
Insides compared to people's outsides.
Wow, perfectly said.
Yeah.
So I'm feeling a little bit blue, and I'm scrolling through my Facebook feed, and everybody, let's face it, we post our most wonderful externalized outs, and I want to post what I want you to think that I really feel. So we're posting vacation photos and look at me photos, and now that only amplifies, gee, my life sucks. Look how wonderful their lives are. So it's this amplification effect, and and I kind of joke around saying if there was a social media where we posted our worst days, then maybe that would make me feel better. It's like, here's me having a crappy day. All right, maybe my life's not. Yeah. They also studied it was at Case Western Reserve, where they studied what was called hypertexting and hyper-networkers. Hypertexter is a young person who texts over 120 times a day. Again, not that much by a lot of standards. And the hyper-networker is somebody who's on social media for over 3 hours a day. All those folks were, they had a whole list of criteria of problematic behavioral and social emotional outcomes, and they all were, being a hypertexter and a hyper-networker was not a good thing. They had more behavioral outbursts, higher incidence of mental health issues, more instances of multiple sexual partners, more instances of problems at school, problems with their families. By all metrics, it was not good to be a hypertexter or a hyper-networker. And there were several other studies that looked at the depression link with social media. So the other part that I want to talk about a little bit, those of you that do work with, how many of you do work with schools or school-based? So some of you do work with schools. So schools are now the digital drug dealers. They're the ones that are incorporating screens in the classroom and portable screens, and at younger and younger ages, right? So they used to have tablets at the high school level, the middle school, elementary school, where I'm from in New York. They're trying to give tablets to kindergartners and preschoolers. And my narrative, it's not my narrative, there's no research that shows that there's any educational benefit. There's not one study that shows that a kid in kindergarten with a Chromebook has better educational outcomes in middle school or high school. So it's the great lie of education, but school administrators have bought the lie from tech companies. It's kind of like big pharma and doctors. Big tech has wined and dined a lot of school municipalities, and they've sold their product under this pretense, but the research just isn't there. And I've dealt with dozens of school administrators, and all I ask them is, show me the one study. Show me the one study that in your district you're accessing teachers and you're going all in on tech, that is somehow good for the child. And I usually get some version of humana, but Apple says it's good. So I wrote an op-ed for Time Magazine. It gives you an idea what I thought about it. It was screens in schools are a $60 billion hoax. Education tech or ed tech is a $60 billion a year industry. Big money involved. And unfortunately, the research just doesn't bear out that there's any advantage to it. Dr. John Valence is headmaster of Australia's top school, Sydney Grammar, and he had a really nice quote. I think when people come to write the history of this period of education, this investment in classroom tech is going to be seen as a huge fraud. And as I said, the research, the OECD, which is a pretty comprehensive global organization, did a 2015 report, and they said that heavy users of computers in the classroom do a lot worse in most learning outcomes, and that in the end, technology can amplify great teaching, but great technology cannot replace poor teaching. And then there was a meta-study by Durham University that looked at 48 other studies, and they concluded technology-based interventions tend to produce just slightly lower levels of improvement when compared with other research interventions and approaches. This narrative that screens are somehow good for education, when we look at the top school system in the world, it's Finland. And Finland has rejected portable screens in schools. Their education minister has said, we find them to be a distraction and not beneficial at all to the learning environment. And so they've rejected them entirely. How many of you read on a Kindle or like to read digitally versus how many of you prefer a book, or how many of you always have them? Those of you prefer books? Why? Dinosaurs? Why do you prefer reading a book?
Because I can highlight, I can go back and forth. It's actually physically in front.
Physical. That's an important concept of physicality. We call it the topography of the page. So Anne Magin was a reading researcher out of Norway, and she studied retention rates. If you read a the same content on a digital screen versus a paper page, the retention rates were 20% greater on the paper page. Now, it was the same content, and that was a little bit odd, so people said, why would that be? And there was primarily two reasons. So we talked about the bottom part. There is a physicality in reading, the topography and physical landscape of the printed page. What that means is a book has north, east, south, and west. These are orienting markers that help us orient and cue what we've just read. So when I read something, I have a signpost on the upper left quadrant. I just read this section. It helps me recall it. When I'm scrolling, and what the hell did I just read? Scroll, it becomes a big blur. There's no signpost to help me recall what part of what I just read. So recalling things becomes much more challenging when I'm scroll reading as opposed to left, north, east, south, west, middle of the page. I remember that part. And the other part of it is the blue light radiant effect versus the reflective lighting effect. For millions of years, we've evolved as creatures that process things with our eyes from reflected light. Reading things from radiant light is unnatural, and there's been some research that indicates that our brain doesn't process things from reflected light as well as it does from radiant light versus reflected light. So when you're reading something in the book, the light reflects off the page, and your brain processes reflected light as opposed to a glow. The glow is not in sync with the way that our brain was conditioned evolutionarily to process things. That's the other part of that. Here's some interesting, and why is reading important? Now we're talking about things about education, but also as a culture. Screens have also atrophied kids' enjoyment of reading. And that's significant, and this research will show you why. So in 2013, they did a study with 17,000 people, birth to 50. And they found, they do all these studies where they try to find predictors of lifelong success. What's the one thing that's going to be the best determinant about whether Kim has a wonderful life or not? And so it's like, what is it? Is it, whether your mother hugged you enough? Was it whether you, drank chocolate milk? Was it whether, and they teased it down to one thing. They found that reading level at age 7 was the most important indicator of future socioeconomic status. So, okay, I want you to put that in the back of your minds. Reading level at age 7. Then the OECD did a study that found that reading for pleasure at age 15 was the most important indicator of future success. So you've got reading competence at 7 and reading for pleasure at age 15 were the two main drivers or predictors of future successful outcomes in your lives. So, but according to research, kids who read on screens are 3 times less likely to enjoy reading. So we just read that reading for pleasure is a key driver of future outcomes, and screens take that away from us. The other part of that was, according to recent research, kids are reading much less. The proportion who never read tripled from 1984 to 2014. And here's the other takeaway. In 1984, 64% of 17-year-olds said they read for pleasure once a week or more. In 2014, 45% of 17-year-olds said they read for pleasure once or twice a year. So kids are reading much less in the digital age. And research shows that reading competency and reading for pleasure are important. And yet the digital age is siphoning that out of our kids. So it's not a good barometer for future development. Interestingly, and I love this, most people that I give these talks to find this part maybe the most fascinating part of all. Who are the most tech-cautious parents? The digital drug dealers. Steve Jobs wouldn't let his kids have iPads. There was a famous interview with in 2010 when the iPad came out, and the reporter said to him, "Oh my God, your kids must be in heaven. You're the inventor of the iPad." He's like, "My kids don't have iPads." Yeah. Good enough for your kids, not good enough for his kids. When they did a New York Times article about Silicon Valley execs in Apple and Google and Yahoo engineers, and a large number of their kids were enrolled in the Los Altos Waldorf School, a non-tech school. And they clearly said, we want our children to develop their brains naturally, And they said, they're not going to be behind the 8 ball, because the big narrative, right? What's the big narrative for a lot of us as parents? If we don't get our kids, digitally competent early, they'll be what? They'll be behind. There's like this digital arms race. If my kid's not on screens by the time he's 2, 6 months, in utero. So it's getting our kids, but it's a false narrative. And in fact, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, Montessori students, didn't see a screen till they were 13. Jeff Bezos, Mr. Taking Over the World Amazon, Montessori student. The inventor of Wikipedia, Waldorf student. The main drivers of the technology movement had tech-free childhoods. That should tell us something. It opened up their ability to create and to expand. If they, I would suggest that if Jeff Bezos and Sergey Brin and Larry Page were subjects of their own devices, that if they had screens when they were 2 or 3, they wouldn't be who they were, because they would have been developmentally stunted. So, what's the solution? I've worked with a lot of technology addiction. It's similar in a lot of ways to treating substance addiction, but different in some ways as well. I can tell you that it's really challenging because those of us that treat substance addiction, we know that there's an abstinence model, right? Most of us who treat substance addiction, we talk about, detoxing, and you can live a happy and fulfilling life being drug and alcohol free. But how do we ask somebody to be technology abstinent in the 21st century United States of America? Almost impossible. So now, because I worked with some people who have really fallen off the cliff with technology. They've had, as I said, psychiatric episodes, they've lost their families, they've been in treatment programs, and the big challenge is how do they re-enter a society that's digital? So in that sense, it's similar to an eating disorder. So we talk about folks that have disordered eating and having to develop a healthy self-concept and then a healthy relationship with food once they've developed a healthy self-concept. In that sense, treating tech addiction is similar. But prevention is a lot easier than, treatment. So delay portable electronic devices until at least age 10. Parents practice what you preach, watch and moderate their own tech habits. No screens at the dinner table. And yes, have the whole family eat and talk together. You guys remember that old Jamie Lee Curtis public service announcement? Jamie Lee Curtis used to do a anti-drug PSA, and she used to say, the best anti-drug, lasagna. And she used to talk about the family that eats dinner at home together and has lasagna. There was a lot of research that showed that in and of itself lowered the incidence of drug addiction. And similar here with screens as well. Talk together, eat together as a family. Talk to your children early and often about tech concerns. Foster balanced, resilient, empathic, and emotionally strong children. And let your children be bored. Boredom is the mother of all invention and neurosynaptic growth. When you're bored, you got to create. So boredom is not a bad thing if you're a kid growing up. I try to tell that to my bored kids all the time. Screen addiction and diagnosis for the clinicians in the room, it is very similar diagnostic criteria to substance addiction. The main driver is it adversely impacting your life? And I've worked with both social media and by the way, pornography is a part of this continuum. So these are all screen experiences. Is it negatively impacting your life? Are your grades suffering? Are you dropping out of school? Are you losing your job? Is your wife walking out on you? I did an intervention on 2020 on a 44-year-old insurance executive who was playing Grand Theft Auto all day and all night. His lawyer wife was about to leave him, 4 young children. And they flew me in and we did this intervention. He had a 10-year-old son. Little kid came in from playing baseball, and I asked his son, we talked a little bit about his life, and I said, tell me about you and your dad. My daddy loves video games more than he loves me. The kid just shaking, sobbing uncontrollably. And the father was a nice guy. He wasn't somebody that was conscious, like a lot of addicts, wasn't consciously hurting his children, but he had a compulsion, and he couldn't stop this compulsion. Quick side note, when we did the intervention, we took away, he had a man cave full of video games, right? And we had to put them in boxes and get rid of them. we were driving him to, we were supposed to put him in a U-Haul and store him in the location. He wouldn't know where we were storing his games because he agreed to have us get rid of the games but not throw them away. And it was about midnight, and the producers of the show now were going to the hotel, and he calls us up in the car, and he said, "Where are my games going to spend the night?" And we said, "Well, in the freaking trunk of the car. I mean, where are your games going to spend the night? Can you get him a room, please, because it'll be cold." 44-year-old insurance executive. My games will be cold. And not me, but the producer said, "All right, we'll check in the room." And God, so help me God, got a bellboy who got a car, and he's like, "You guys checking out a room for these games?" And we're like, "Yeah, don't ask, just can we get a room for these games?" And we checked these games into the room, but he is so emotionally attached to these games. He was so enmeshed with these games that he wanted them to be warm and safe. That's the level of problem that we're talking about. And again, his wife is about to leave him and everything else. Tech addiction treatment, we do talk about a 4 to 6 week digital detox to recalibrate the adrenal system and get the brain back to baseline. As I said earlier, similar to eating disorder protocols. Develop a healthy self-concept before you can develop a healthy relationship with the screen. Oftentimes the gamer or other social media devotees' identity is inextricably tied to their screen identities. This is the key difference to substance addiction in my experience. Most drug addicts that we work with, they don't have a positive association with their addiction, right? You don't say like, "Hey, I'm a crack addict." You know, it's not, it's something that tends to be somewhat shame-based. Gamers, on the other hand, have a really positive tie-in to their gaming accomplishments. I'm a level 78 gamer. That's my achievement. That's all I've achieved. And so now you're asking them to give that up, but it's the only thing I'm good at. I analogize it to being a violin virtuoso, and you're asking them to give up the violin. So with a lot of gamers, they have a positive identification to their gaming accomplishments, and you're asking them to give up the only thing that they're good at. And they haven't made the connection that it's hurting their lives yet. So, part of the work is to help them see that it is stunting their growth as human beings, and to replace that accomplishment with something else more meaningful. Yeah, being a level 78 gamer is okay, but can you have some other sense of accomplishment in your life that you could also hitch your wagon to? Nurture alternative non-screen experiences, nature immersion protocols. Alternative non-screen experiences, like any other substance, here's one fundamental thing as we wind it down. We talked before about, as those of us who work as therapists, we know addictions, a lot of it is about escape, right? My life sucks, and I'm going to check out with a pill, a bottle, a powder. And so we have to understand that for a lot of our young folks, this is also their form of escape. I was working with one young man that comes to mind. I was working with a 14-year-old mildly Asperger freshman, and blonde-haired, blue-eyed, really sweet kid, sensitive, very fragile kid, and really came from a very toxic, dysfunctional family. His father was physically disabled. He was amputee diabetic, and his mother was mentally ill, schizophrenic. And in their home, it was the home of a schizophrenic. It was chaos, and there was animals and ferrets and guinea pigs and bugs and literally feces all over the place. So this poor kid comes to school second week freshman year, and he opens up his jacket and 3 cockroaches pop out of his shirt. So now, because we know how high school is, for the rest of his high school career, his name was Roach Boy. Roach Boy. So this kid was the sweetest, most fragile kid, but now in his 8 hours a day at school, he was Roach Boy. 8 hours at home, he lives in hell. And so he started playing a game called Final Fantasy XIV. And in Final Fantasy XIV, he's got an avatar, and he's rescuing the universe from these light orbs, and it's a hero's journey. He's a hero in this game. His life is great in this game, and he was playing it 10 hours a day. I got it. I would rather be playing Final Fantasy XIV if I was Roach Boy and had such a terrible home setting. So it wasn't as if the game itself was the problem, his life was the problem. And how do we help him make his life more palatable so that he doesn't need the crutch? And it's the same way with a lot of substance addiction. My life sucks, that's why I'm using. You know, yeah, you can tell me using is not good for me, but my life's not good for me. So similar dynamics that way. And the other part of it is the screen experience can be so seductive. It's a shortcut. You could be a magical, mythical warrior. In Second Life, you could create the life of your choosing. In Second Life, a lot of adults are getting addicted to Second Life. How many of you are familiar with Second Life? So if you hate your life, you're a clerk somewhere, you could be a rock star, a musician, a poet, and you could live your entire world in Second Life. And there's a whole addictive stories about people who don't leave Second Life because their Second Life avatar life is better than their real life. So creating real life experiences that are immersive and powerful and engaging, a life of purpose and passion, which is kind of what we talk about at Omega. Unless I can help shift you into an experience in the real world that is passionate and meaningful for you, well, the gravitational pull of the device or the drug is too powerful. I've got to have a countervailing force that pulls you off of that experience. And then finally, it's learning to identify digital vegetables versus digital candy. And what that means is there are healthier uses of technology versus unhealthy use of technology. So doing research online is a healthier use of technology than playing Candy Crush, which is just mindless, sort of addictive candy. And if you're vulnerable to that, then you know that that's going to be a relapse trigger for your experiences. And by the way, I worked with a young man. He had a pretty well-known, his mother was a celebrity, pretty well-known. And this young man at 16, he developed a really bad video game addiction. He robbed his mother, hurt his mother. She sent him away to 2 wilderness programs, 2 years of a special school in Virginia, where he had no screens for 2 years. Moves back to Santa Monica, gets a smartphone, and within 1 week, right off the cliff again. So his reentry plan was not there, and he was still vulnerable to, he was abstinent for 2 years, so he didn't develop the skills to be able to function well in the everyday world. So that sort of concludes our, I know I threw a lot of stuff at all of you, and at this point, if any of you have any questions about any part of what I've talked about, or if you want to comment or throw any ripe tomatoes at me, or now's the time to do it. Yes.
When I hear parents talking about like their 8 or their 10-year-old doing, what's the name of it? Fortnite. And they're kind of like going back and forth and saying that all the other kids in their class are doing it, so it's a social thing.
Right. What they were saying with the one where the Pokemon Go, they're getting outdoors. You know, they're chasing a hallucination, looking at their phone, but they're outdoors. The social aspect of gaming is the synthetic socialization. Folks, for social interactions to be meaningful, psychologists have found that we have to make eye contact 70% of the time. So for a social interaction to be meaningful and resonant, I have to look at you 70% of the time. On Facebook, I'm not looking at you any of the time. What unfortunately they found is that people under 25 only make eye contact 25% of the time, even when they're talking face to face. So it's this idea that if we're talking to each other, and you're talking to the top of my head, and I'm talking to the top of your head because we have text it doesn't do it for me. Talking to the top of someone's head doesn't create the social, emotional connection that we are needed. So kids playing a massive player game like that, headsets, that's the backdoor lie. The gaming company say it's social, but it's not social in the way that they need to be social. Yeah.
Do you think with the advent of these like colleges that are providing scholarships for kids that do this?
Yeah, Robert Brown, the one in Chicago, there was the one small school in Chicago, was the first, well, the first one 2 years ago was the first one that gave Division I athletic scholarship for e-athletes. And by the way, esports is the fastest growing viewer of sports on television, on ESPN. To me, it's a problem because I worked with a lot of gamers. 10 years ago, a gamer used to say, I want to become a professional gamer. And it was like, yeah, there's no such thing as a professional gamer. But now, there are $1 million gamers. And I've had kids tell me, look, you want to be Michael Jordan, you know, realistic or not as it may have been, this is my dream. I want to be a professional gamer. So that's complicated the equation because there is a financial path to but what we usually try to tell kids is like if you want to be a pro ball player, those percentages are real small. They want to have a backup plan anyway. But it's a problem because if you're gaming that much, I have not met a gamer who's an A student. Most of my gamers who tend to be very bright, by the way, are CEU students. So, because it goes back to they're so compulsively gaming, they're not doing schoolwork. But it makes it harder because now they have this thing they're chasing. Anybody else have any questions or comments about any part of the presentation? So the uplifting part of the presentation is I have seen, because I've done this for the last 2 or 3 years, and I just came back from New Zealand a few months ago, and I was in Europe talking about this. People are waking up to this issue because 3 years ago we were all asleep about it. And so now people are beginning to realize it's kind of like anything else. We need to be thoughtful about it. And like I analogize it to like driving a car. My car is great, but I don't flip in my car keys because he's too young. So we are beginning to wake up to it, and I think there's a pushback movement to get back to basics and to be a little bit more nature-based and to be a little bit more grounded. And I think that's going to be such the pendulum is shifting in a healthier way. So is that uplifting enough?
Nick? Yeah.
Just a quick take on the apps and programs you can buy that limit the screen time because they're using Quizlets for things for studying. Because I need my computer, I need my phone, so I bought an item that turns it off and tells me exactly how much time they're on each one of those things. I'm curious if you're familiar
I think those are helpful. A couple of them had asked me to endorse them. I think it's helpful if parents could have some limiting of it. I'm not a big fan of using the screen as a reward, by the way. So like a lot of parents will say, if you play outside for 2 hours, you get an hour of game time. Because what you're doing is you're still incentivizing, when you're creating this value metric, the screen experience is still God, and then the kids tend to rush through everything else to get that, as opposed to creating an intrinsic valuing of the other experiences, whether it's sports or music or school or reading or just playing. But so many parents, if you do that, then you get this, and the kids fly through that to get to that. But I think the controls that you talk about can be helpful to limit, but the kid still gets, again, it depends on the age and depends on the other factors of your children, how old they are. My whole thing is the older they are, the better shot they have at impulse control with some of these issues. Yeah.
So I first appreciate all of your research studies. Second, though, I was wondering, most of the research studies for screen time are obviously with social media and gaming. Are you finding more and more research studies that deal with students using, and that is a whole passive and active, but I'm wondering, are there any social sort of research studies that impact or kind of look at the way they're being used in schools and the longevity of that?
Well,
what does that look like?
The school research is not there. The school research shows that the school research, what typically tends to happen is the kids will then use it for texting other purposes. So it's not really being used in the way that it was intended. When the Los Angeles School District went all in on the $1.3 billion Apple fiasco, Pearson software was undeveloped, the kids had hijacked the equipment and it sat on the shelf, and there was a whole FBI investigation over it, which we'll take your word about that one. Yeah, so that part of it, I can tell you that it's not just gaming, and it's, like I said, it's pornography. I had a word, you guys remember a couple of years ago, during the election cycle, the Trump Tower climber? So I had worked with, so the Trump Tower climber kid was an interesting young man. So during the primaries, there was a young man who went with suction cups and tried to climb Trump Tower. So he wasn't a gamer, he wasn't a social media guy, he was politically interested kid who was reading political blogs. Hyperlink, 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 hyperlink. So he'd stay up 2 or 3 days, and you would just go down the rabbit hole of hyperlink searching. And that information overload caused a psychotic break where he went there, and we worked with him. That was information overload. Kids and pornography. Okay, so there's a new phenomenon now called adolescent erectile dysfunction. That's what I said. Adolescent erectile dysfunction. Kids are getting so desensitized to sexual experiences because of their overly exposed to pornography that it has essentially led to that. And so that's a phenomenon now that pediatricians talk about. never used to exist in prior days. So there are other sort of ancillary things that are happening. So it's not just gaming and social media, it's the whole screen immersion can be other tentacles.
Well, I agree on the reason part as well. So yes.
I just wanted to acknowledge all the good information and I really don't, I'm not looking for the happy ending because it's actually, I'm uncomfortable right now, which is gonna move me into action. I think that's why I appreciate the work you've done to kind of cope with this. And I think it's extremely, the comparison between big pharma and education, that's big. So that's, I wanna see the solution.
Well, Bob, and your work, Bob's kind of work, you know, rite of passage and Jürgen archetypal, that is part of the solution. By the way, the video game companies have hijacked archetypal heroes' journeys. The video companies have understood very early on that we are hardwired, we seem to have this thirst for archetypal, mythological hero's journey type of processes, and so almost every video game is a hero's journey. And it taps into that need. So these kids, because there's a lot of sociologists have written about how the modern age we've demystified the world, right? There's no Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, God. So kids are living in this demystified world, with a secularized world, yet their video game world is it's full of mythology, full of archetype. And it seems they've tapped into that and experience.
Counterfeit spirituality.
Exactly. So some of your work is a perfect countervailing force to part of these synthetic experiences. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Is there anyone looking at the impact on teens when it comes to social media like Instagram and the messaging between individuals like for dating purposes? Like the impact of the enhancement of emojis and texting throughout the day and how that's affecting love, dating, and sexuality? Like that aspect? Not the gaming world, but like, because my 14-year-old daughter has her first boyfriend and they're on Instagram and I'm like, holy cow.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother.
Well, yeah, and I think we talked about like the whole Tinder aspect to relationships. The relationships have gotten to be much more.
Yeah, but kids growing up in the digital age versus those of us that are like in the dating market as adults. I just wonder if you come across anyone.
Not specific research, but I can tell you when I did groups, when I used to have 14-year-old groups, they had seen things both sexually and violently. I had one group that they had just, in school, they had just watched a mutilation, decapitation snuff film. And it was on, I forgot what website it was, and they were so, God bless them, they were protective of me. Like, Dr. K, we don't want to tell you the website, it was just not, because you can't unsee what we've just seen. So these poor kids have it in their heads. So kids have seen imagery that when we were kids, we couldn't even imagine, both sexually and violently. So they've gotten old ahead of their time, but yet, what I write about in Glow kids have seen things beyond their years, but yet they've also stayed in adolescent mode because it's this failure to launch syndrome. So kids with their instant gratification, impulse control, so kids have stayed perpetually in adolescence while they've seen things beyond their years. It's a little bit of a paradoxical thing. The 30-year-old living in his parents' basement video gaming, who was that 14-year-old who saw things that you and I couldn't have imagined when we were 14. But yet it keeps them not from developing as proper adults.
Are there any laws to help regulate what kids can access?
Well, the game school shooter, and there was a Columbine RPG game, they all use First Amendment laws. They kind of say it's First Amendment issues, but there's some grassroots movements. You go back to the fielding messages. A woman that I've been in contact with, she was a mother in Maryland, Cindy Eckhart. She got legislation passed to limit schools. There have been parents that have tried to sue the gaming companies. The next movement, to go back to the cigarette company, is there's Robert Lessig is a Harvard class action attorney. The next step, at least for the gaming industry, is class action lawsuit. And that's sort of in the groundwork now. There's a class action suit developing, like we did with tobacco in the 50s, to basically say, you've known that this is damaging, you've done it anyway, and now here are 5 or 7 or 10 families that are going to hit the knees and sue you to at least put warning labels, at least to do a caveat of this and to begin to limit them in terms of how they're doing it or how they're marketing it. But currently there's not a lot.
around here, the drug programs, programs.
Right. Well, again, I want to thank you all for coming today on this day, and it was nice meeting a lot of you, and hopefully you've gotten a little bit more information about this issue. Thank you.